Okay, welcome everybody and Happy New Year. Today we have Steve Stesney, who's going to be talking about his experiences in working across the aisle in organizations, implementing knowledge graphs, et cetera. We're all looking forward to it. And with that, I will allow Steve to take the reins and get going. Welcome,
Sure.
Steve.
Welcome. Hey, everybody. So, as Andrew mentioned, I have two really in-depth experiences at implementing knowledge graphs in two different types of organizations, which, in talking to Andrew last month, he thought it'd be interesting for me to come and share. So I'll sort of talk through those. But as always, it's an open forum. So if you have questions, you have, points or anything you want to bring up, please feel free. And then also, I've been implementing graphs in other types of organizations as well with my current work as sort of a consultant and sort of also a product manager as well too. So also sort of bring those in as well too. But please feel free, jump in, ask questions. Let me know if you have any thoughts at all as we sort of start off here and look forward to the conversation. So I was chatting with Andrew, as I mentioned last month, and started to talk about one of the experiences I had. I worked for a public affairs firm. And in that public affairs firm, the structure or the organization, it was really critical to sort of getting this project off the ground. It was a partnership. So there were 12 partners, and each partner had a specific budget item in their budget, their budget, which they were, their P&L, which they were responsible for, that pertained to product development. And the executive group was a group of 2 or 3 of those partners, and they would get together and they would, make strategic decisions as a company. And they would, in this case, in my role, they wanted to go ahead with a product development focused on building out what we now know as sort of an expert finder. And so, sort of just that general parameter there that there was an executive team, and this executive team then had, was comprised of, 3 or 4 of the partners, but 12 partners that they oversaw. And then the development budget and the work budget all came out of each partner budget. And so when I was brought into this organization, they asked me to figure out a way in which the challenge they had was that they had a lot of information from a lot of the different work that they've done from a public affairs realm. So they had client work, they had media work, they had campaign work. They had all of this different data, information, knowledge, all stored in different documents, Excel spreadsheets and all that. And they wanted to pull it all together because it's really, really difficult for them to recreate the wheel every time they did a proposal, every time that they wanted a final report. When someone left, they took a lot of that knowledge with them. And a lot of this information was just sitting in different folders. So the goal for me, the objective that they gave me was to pull all that information together and then, really start to really derive value from that so that they could, meet other business objectives and business development, report writing and all of that. And so, the way that I structured it and built it is I built a knowledge graph. And so, the first step in working with the different groups was to go around, first of all, for each partner. And really, I had to, first of all, sort of defend the fact that I was the one as part of this development and really share with them exactly how this product that the executive committee wanted to invest in was going to affect them, and really worked with each one of them to really help them to understand, not so much the actual inner workings of the knowledge graph, because they really didn't care about that. They really cared about how their team was going to value from it, what they were looking to get out of it, and really understand what they wanted to get out of it, and then how their team would use it. And that's really what those conversations were focused on, and working with each of those partners to do. And then, so there was that level of conversation that I really focused on with each of the partners. And then for each of the teams underneath them, once I was sort of got their buy-in to what we were building and how we were going to build it, then went to each teams and, asked them to help me find the information. But I had to get the partners buy-in in order for their teams to spend the time and the effort to actually, get the information I was looking for. So it was a very interesting aspect of the way that, I needed to do it. And there was a lot of there's a lot of pitfalls to that conversation because, each partner is different. Each partner has different ideas. There were a couple of partners who were great and were really into it and really wanted to go forward with it. There are other partners who saw this budget item on their P&L and were like, no, this isn't gonna, like, what am I gonna get out of it? And we're really specific about the return on investment. So I had to approach each of those different 12 partners really, really differently and really focus in on getting what they were going to get out of it in a way that made sense to them in order to get their buy-in. So it was a tricky challenge, but most of my job really wasn't even focused on building the knowledge graph. It was focused on getting these 12 partners aligned so that we could actually do the development on the side. So I was spending most of my time, even though I was a product manager, basically getting the buy-in for these 12 partners initially. And then from there, not only getting their buy-in, getting them to promise their resources to help me then build it, because I needed them to instruct their teams to pull the information that was going to be needed to build it. So it was a big initiative, but mainly all focused around communication, working with the stakeholders, partner engagement, and getting that information back. Building it was another story. Building the actual knowledge graph wasn't that challenging. Pulling the information together, you know, doing that, all that was actually the easier part of the process. So that's just one experience. Any thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I have a question, Steve. What I really hear out of what you've just described is that there was an awful lot of self-interest in the individual partners. Was there any sense that there was a greater good for the organization as a whole, or was that absent?
It wasn't absent. I think people understood the fact that there needed to be, they're a public affairs firm, and there needed to be some sort of differentiator between how they did business. And one of the ways that they could differentiate themselves was their operational aspects, and the way that they took information and sort of regurgitated it at a later date. We're able to reapply information and what they've learned for new proposals. So their self-interest also was aligned with the business development interest, right? They could take this information, they could write proposals faster, they could include more information, they can include past work. There's a lot of that sort of self-interest, which also aligned with the greater good of the company, right? The more business that the company does, the bigger the teams and everything will continue to grow. So there was a lot of self-interest when it came to budgets, when it came to resources, but the overall idea of it was also, in building it, was also focused on the larger company good as well too.
And did the final result reflect that larger umbrella, if you like, or did it appear that you saw the areas of self-interest being emphasized in the actual result?
So I think the end result was focused on the larger self-interest. One of the challenges with this type of, more with the partners being a little bit more self-interest was, they were like, oh, I want this feature, or I want this functionality, and this specifically to help my team. And that was one of the bigger challenges because you get the scope, you get the creep, but you also sort of playing a political game, right? A little bit of negotiation, like, okay, fine, we'll take this data set. And so to be really careful with conflicting those self-interests with overall product interests. But the end scope was in the sort of the end product that was delivered was focused on the overall business objectives of being able to help business development, being able to help report writing, maintaining the knowledge of the people who come and go through a public affairs firm, and really being able to get to a point where they weren't starting from zero with every new proposal. They were starting at 50, 60, 70, 80% of the information they had within their fingertips through pulling information back through the knowledge graph that they could then go with. And the challenge was really separating out those self-interests versus what I can deliver overall for the team. For the company. Now I got a little bit of luck in that the executive team did a really good job of helping with that. If if one of the partners was getting too self-interested or a little bit, far aside, maybe they start to complain about the budget or things like that. The executive team did a good job of helping me with that, but also coming in, and when those situations were arise, they would come in and help guide that partner and sort of get him or her back on the boat a little bit for me.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like a really enlightened executive team that you were able to work with, and you had their buy-in. Can you tell us how you got their buy-in?
So they actually were struggling this for years. So this was something that from a public affairs firm for years, a lot of turnover, not only in the lower staff, but also in the partner ranks too. Then when a lot of the work that's done and a lot of business development done is done by the Rolodex or the contacts that the person has. So for years, they've dealt with this challenge of doing these really interesting campaigns for clients, and whether it's the partner, the director, or the team is no longer there. And they still retained all of that information. So they had a real challenge with that. So in a sort of strange aligning of stars, I actually built a product for another firm that they purchased that helped with that process, that helped them understand sort of the landscape and the people and the experts who were in a field. And they saw that and they were like, we want to create something like that specifically for us. So they were bought into the idea when they brought me in, and bringing me in was part of and built, allowing me to build my team and build up sort of the data practice of the public affairs firm. They were really already bought into this idea of this could solve a huge concern and issue and business issue for the public affairs firm. So getting a little sort of further afield sort of in the implementation aspects of this, and one of the bigger challenges I had was working with each of the different groups. So we had multiple groups. A lot of the partners dealt specifically with client work, but there was also a series of back office type of activities as well too, that were cost centers for each of the partners. So we had a media group, and this media group was basically serviced out by the partners for specific campaigns. We had a research group, we had a digital group, but these were the groups that were actually doing some of the implementation. So they had a lot of great data. And so one of the challenges I had is I had to then work with each of those groups as well too. And their initial sort of, the challenge with this is that I was asking them for data, I was asking them for access, I was asking them for information, which they then had to spend time and effort and go back and collect. But they were a cost center to the company. And so there was a lot of hesitancy to work with each of these groups to pull that information back. They really struggled with, who does it, the questions I kept getting asked from these groups were, where does the allocation go? Which partner does it go to? How does it work? All of that. There was a lot of just business accounting these groups like the media group really want to turn around and see direct value from the product, right? This was a company level initiative. This is a product for business development. This is a product for, the partners to really help the partners. So there's interesting aspects in working with that as well too. And pulling together the different ones, once we got the information, that was the easier part. But it was difficult to work with each of those groups because they had specific, agendas, they had specific areas that they needed to focus on. And also when you're dealing with cost centers within, a billable firm, they've got to bill hours, right? They've got to bill hours to specific clients. And whenever they're not billing hours to specific clients, their margins and their group, their aspect starts to decline. And so, really working with them to figure out what they could do, how they could get it, what help I could offer from a data perspective, because I had a little bit more leeway, right? My role was to, really facilitate and get this information. So I could expend costs. So I started to take on costs from a data perspective in a data group to get that information and to work with them and sort of work with them as sort of more sort of managers, but then getting into the weeds and all of that and pulling back the information was also, that's also just part of the challenge. And it was interesting how much of it went back to the P&L management of the different groups, whether they were a cost center, whether they were a partner, and where all that came about was some for me, coming from more of a product based role before. Where it was more about the product, there was already a budget, there was a roadmap and all of that. This was one of the most challenging aspects of that was that from not only a partner level, but also sort of a group level within the cost centers within the company. There was also that notion that the value needed to be retained, and that we need to find billable hours for all of that work. And it was very, very interesting to work with each of those groups to pull that information and get that information out.
Were there any specific techniques that you used to be able to demonstrate that value and how that was being maybe eroded by some of the things that they were currently doing?
Yeah, so one of the groups I worked with was a research group. And this was the group that was charged with, finding the information that was needed for proposals, looking at specific client campaigns and finding specific information about whether the people, the organizations within the client. So specifically with the research group, as the product was being built, I was bringing them in and showing them the value that they were getting out of the research that was already in the product. So I would go in and say, oh, you're interested in who we can talk to in Idaho about, a mining project regarding copper. And so as we were pulling in and building the product, I was working with them heavily to really show them the amount of hours, the amount of time they would save by pulling back this information. Now, a lot of it was a little bit of a, especially in the first couple aspects of the project, a lot of sort of behind the curtain of Oz, where I would work with them. I'd get a request and we'd push back the information, but, it would really show them the value. So one of the things that they started to then use, our services more and really help define the product for them, which was really great. But then also I was able to use those hours that were saved and those specific experiences and shared them with others. And shared them with other teams, and specifically like with the media group, like this is what we can do over here and this is what we can do over there, and really worked with each of the cost centers to show them how a 10-hour investment here or a 15-hour investment over a month gets you this and gets you that, and really started to share that and really found that sort of that initial use case from a research perspective and spread that around informally, and not only in my talks to the partners, but in talks to the cost centers. So they started to see the value that was being created. And some of them were great. Some, even though they weren't going to see a tremendous return, from their own time in the research that could be completed with it, they saw the value that was being created from different groups being able to get in and get the information.
And that's great, thank you. And just to follow on, if I may, without stealing everyone's time here, is was there a tipping point at which that value was being realized at such a level that people, instead of going to their traditional sources, actually went to the knowledge graph as a first point of reference? Yeah,
there was definitely a tipping point, especially from in a public affairs realm where you have all of these different very small silos, but all of these different small workflows. And, the tool that we were building was an enterprise level tool. So, different groups, like, for example, research was in there. But one of the ways I was able to sort of get people to get interested in the product was to highlight the use cases that were so when research came in and or a specific ask came in, and so I was able then to communicate those asks out, and one of the things it led to was a business development proposal in particular. There was some information about the different groups working with one particular group, and that people understood that from again a public affairs firm, a lot of it's in the mind. People understood that we work with this group, but what they didn't understand was the different amount of relationships that the different groups within the public affairs had with this one group. And so when we were writing a proposal, or I forget exactly who was writing the proposal, which group it was, but as the knowledge graph was being built, it started then, the data started to become started to link the different areas. And so you started to then see like, oh, we know this group. And not only do we know this group, we know them because we worked here. They work with this group over here. They have a direct relationship with this person over here. And then for one proposal, it was a very thorough understanding of the organization. And it gave the organization a really understanding of how to focus themselves on the proposal. And we won the proposal. And that was just something that's when all of a sudden people are like, oh, now I'm seeing it. Now I'm getting it. And the requests started to come in more frequently. And that's sort of how it built. So that was it. It was that one, all of a sudden that one light bulb started to go off. And then that just led to more.
That's great. Thank you.
Steve, is there a particular way in which you engage these cost centers of people working in there such that they are more amenable to, taking out their time when they don't see the big picture? And do you make an attempt early on to explain the vision, or do you just start off with, I have a set of questions and let's start here? How does that work?
Yeah, I think, especially sort of in the graph world where you're working with different groups and different people, I started from, realized very quickly after the first few months in the organization that it was all going to be built on relationships. If I was going to get the information, get the buy-in, and get the just general organizational direction going in one way that I was going to need to be successful, it was all about relationships. So I started at a very early aspect of understanding sort of what the lay of the land is for stakeholders, right? And understanding the business aspects of that behind it. So that was the first step, was the partners. And I just met one-on-one with them, or in small groups, 2 or 3 partners at a time, and built that relationship. That's where we talked about the vision. That's where we talked about how it would help them. That's where I got their buy-in, in general for, with some of their budget concerns and all of that. But then with each group, I would meet in small groups. I would also find individuals who were really bought in, who were really challenged by some of the requests that were coming in, specifically as it talked about, as the request talked about the reports, the research, and all of that. People who spent hours looking up information that I knew eventually would take seconds to find. And so I would work with each of the cost centers directly, meetings, attending a lot of, social events, their calendars, birthday parties, things like that, but really to get to know them and understand them. And then I went more with the sort of the ask of, okay, here's what I'm looking for. Here's the data I need. And also identifying members of those different groups who were really going to be the heroes that I could rely upon to sort of have the voice of the product in meetings and pull information. And there was a few people who were great, who really helped me out in meetings when, there was conversations about, oh, why should we use it? And I wasn't in the meeting. I remember one woman talking to me. She's like, I pulled up the product during the meeting. We went through and we found the information and things like that. So that was the other way I really did that, was really to identify those individuals who could help me when I wasn't there and really do that. But a lot of meetings, a lot of one-on-one talking, a lot of understanding of the core aspects from a cost center perspective about what they needed to deliver and how I fit within that and how my group fit within that to get the information they needed. And then, as we talked about, a few minutes ago, really relaying back that information about the, sort of building that momentum of, hey, look, this was a really cool something that happened over here, or, this group over here is using it here, and communicating that back to those cost centers, and then sort of a slightly different communication to the partner level, which was more about overall business value being delivered through the product development process.
Did you actively cultivate those user advocates, or did that just come about naturally and then you kind of focused in on them and working with them closely so that they in turn could project the vision and the outcomes that everybody wanted?
So both. There were, when I would say, for example, I met with the research department. We also had an investigations department too that really did some really cool work and uncovering some information. I would meet with them, talk through a couple of use cases, talk through, and, you know, really see where they're at and see if there was anybody who I could really think like, oh, this person is really good. And so I would then cultivate that and build off of that. There were other instances where, like I said, a couple of users had these pain points and they saw the vision right away and they're like, let me do what I can do. What can I do to help? Who do I need to talk to? And so a lot of those happenstance, but a lot of it just came through, you know, going out because they were so focused on their own work and siloed in the different groups, just going out, talking to them, meeting with them, working it through and understanding exactly, you know, how we can help. And then, you know, finding or cultivating, you know, some by happenstance as well too, those leaders who could help me.
Thanks.
I'm wondering about the installed base of product and how you addressed what they were used to using and maybe advocating, adopting besides what you were coming up with. You've got this bespoke product that you brought over, but you were customizing it. And a lot of times people are just bought into the next big thing that has a lot of budget behind it, and people are going to subscribe to it, and then they don't use it. So what happened there?
Yeah, so the more interesting aspect from a sort of when I came over, they actually basically asked me to recreate it from a custom development standpoint. So I was able to build my own solution, basically to recreate the wheel, versus going out and just, you know, licensing the product I had built before, which was very interesting. But a lot of this work goes into workflow. So when, you know, for example, the research group, they would go back and look through Excel documents. They would go back and look through Word, and they were using, you know, simple search through Google Drive and other types of, you know, Dropbox search and all of this other information just to find information and look for information. And so what I was able to do was to, you know, take that information, we scraped it, we put it in the knowledge graph, and then we were pulling that information back through them through a search interface. And so I would work with them and I'd be like, okay, how are you doing it now? What is the workflow you do now? And all of that. So the actual initial workflow of finding the information was easy to overcome because it was a lot quicker. They found a lot of information. What was more challenging was what you did with the information once you were presented with it. Before, they would find an Excel document or a Word document, they would highlight something and they'd pull it out and they'd go into Word and they'd start to create their proposal. And so a lot of the challenges of working with them is they saw the value in finding the information. It was then what are the workflow tools that needed to be built into the product that would really help, you know, that aspect as well too. And this was actually one of the challenges I had is that, you know, there comes a point where, you know, recreating that stuff is interesting and the features or functionality are interesting, but it doesn't save a tremendous amount of time. And so that was one of the things that, you know, was really quite the challenge was that secondary workflows. Okay, we're able to have the information, you're able to understand it, you're able to get the value out of it, at least from like an analysis standpoint, right? Like, oh, these are the people who I need to know, these are what I need to do. So then how do we take that information and put it into a proposal, and how do we write about it? You know, the old cutting and pasting of putting things and just creating the document and sending it off, you know, you could do, you know, changing all that, but that was really where the challenges came in with those workflow. And that's where, you know, for me, it was about creating export tools. It was about making sure that actually they could simply, if there was a visual of sort of a network graph, that they could export it as a JPEG and be able to basically put it into a document. If they could export tables and really building in the basic features and functionalities to take sort of what they were looking for and what they found in the product and quickly put it into a Word document that, you know, was reviewed by the partner for a business development proposal.
Not a question, but a comment. I hear that often and experience it as well, where you build a product attempting to eliminate silos, but in a sense, if you don't have a means to let the flow continue into other products, you're dead in the water. You've just created another one.
Yeah, you create another one, and they see the value, right, of all of this information coming in, and like, this is great. This is, saves me all this time on this aspect of it. And then they're like, but I want to, then, finish the process, right? And that's where a lot of the challenge came up, and where, the initial, like I said, the initial part of building the knowledge graph and putting the data and scaling up the data and the sources and all of that, that wasn't sort of the big challenge overall. The big challenge overall from a technical standpoint was integrating their workflows into this product so that they could either do, I mean, we were a large public affairs firm, but we weren't that big, right? We weren't going to recreate, we didn't have the budget to fully recreate all of their workflows in one product. So we had to figure out ways to sort of the bits and pieces of it, of, okay, you want this specific table and chart. All right, let's be able to make sure you can export that in a nice visual, and align it with the branding and the coloring of, the proposals and the RFPs that we normally write. So things like that to sort of shortcut those processes a little bit. But in reality, if, once they found the information, it took them 4 hours to create a report. It took, let's say, 4 hours for the research, 4 hours to create the report. We cut down the research tremendously, but it still took 4 hours to create the report, even with the tools and the integration.
Yeah.
So we're really trying to find out where those basics, the basic features and functionality we could do to make sure that at the very least, it wasn't taking them longer.
And it sounds like there are several layers of workflow that ultimately you'd have to build. So you've got the more granular level that you've just been talking about, but then you've got to build up to the exec suite somehow. Can you tell us, did you manage to do that? How many layers did you build in terms of this workflow optimization?
So we were sort of, based on the structure of the public affairs firm, the partners weren't the ones in the actual product, right? They found it interesting and they would look at it, but they were relying upon their teams to pull that information, get it to them, whether it be for, the partners would walk into a meeting and they would have sort of a notes of, okay, these are the people in the meeting. This is, the topics we've discussed before. So I was really focused on working with the different teams from the user perspective to be able to create stuff like that really efficiently for them. And the executives would be the ones, they would see these notes pages, they would see the reports, they'd see the RFPs and all that, but they weren't the ones creating it. So for them to get their buy-in to this product was to be able, like, for example, one of the cooler things that we were able to do was, if an executive was going into a meeting, we now had a tremendous history of all of the people who potentially may be in that meeting that we worked with or we knew of in the past as a public affairs firm. So they were getting these much fuller notes pages about, okay, we know, Mary, she worked in this and this, oh, she worked here and we worked with her on this and this, and she wrote this op-ed. So they started to see it that way. But I wasn't specifically building the features and the workflows for them. The features in the workflow were all for the partner groups and the people working in the partner groups, not specifically for the partners and the executives.
You had mentioned previously on Dave McComb's call that there was a big difference in what was eye candy for the execs in terms of, the knowledge graph presentation and the views by, boots on the ground. Can you describe that and why that matters?
Yeah, and this actually is that's a really great question that sort of dovetails from Alan's questions as well too. So from a business perspective, one of the main goals of, I talked about in the beginning, was sort of that if you optimize your operations, and you could then create a competitive advantage in the public affairs realm. And so the executives would love to show this product, and did show this product to potential clients as, hey, look, here's how we do it, right? And they would quickly bring up the product in, even if it was still in development, they'd bring it up in a call and be like, hey, look, this is why we're different, right? We've got this a database that, really helps in this knowledge graph, which does all of this really cool stuff, and they would show it. And the biggest thing that would come up would be the visual, right? They look up They look up Bob Smith, right? And sure enough, there's this really cool visual of Bob Smith, and the executive would double click on it and expand out and talk about, here's all the organizations that Bob Smith and they would talk at a very high level with their potential clients about, this is how we visualize and how we go about that. It was all really, really interesting. And to them, it was great. And so they loved it. The executive group loved it and thought it was great. However, as you sort of go through the development process, and it's sort of it was a learning process for me too, right? I really focused the initial aspects of the proof of concept and then the MVP on those visuals, mainly because we didn't have a tremendous amount of data integrated yet, and we knew that we would add the data, but the visuals were something that the executives really loved, and they were the ones who were funding it at the time. So all of that. But as we released the product into production, we kind of knew this going into, especially after the MVP, that the users could, the people who were pulling that information out, creating the notes, creating the reports, they could care less about that visual. And it was interesting, but the users weren't the ones going in and doing the exploratory research, right? They weren't clicking on it and saying, well, who does Bob Smith know? And all of this other stuff. All that information was basically contained in Bob Smith's profile. And so they were looking for specific pieces of information.
Yeah.
And specific people, specific organizations. And so, the product got released, it went into production, and then every year, every 6 months or so, there's budget reviews, and at that point, people start to say, hey, look, what are you looking for next year? What's the roadmap? So the roadmap for the product completely de-emphasized the visuals. And so there was a large conversation with the executive as to why that was, right? And so I had to specifically go back to the users and work with them, really get a lot of qualitative feedback from them about how they were using the product, what the value was, what they were looking for to increase. And the users were really interested in the data, right? They wanted more data sources. They wanted more information that was getting greater context around these people and these organizations that were in there, because this is what they were using for their reports. This is what they were using for this is what they were pulling out of the product. And so I had to collect that. I also went through, since the product was in production, it was an enterprise product, but we weren't huge, but I had enough quantitative data to, through the tracking and the metrics that we put into the product, to be able to say, hey, look, no one's using the visuals, right? It's all really interesting, but the users aren't the ones actually using it. I can tell you how many people exported images, and it was a small amount. And so I had to have a really, interesting conversation with the executives team to say, hey, look, I know that you like the visuals, and the visuals are developed to a point where it's effective for what you want it, right? You can go into a meeting, you can pull it up, you can walk people through it, and it looks really neat, really interesting, but I really don't want to spend any more money on it. And that wasn't, but because here's why, because here's what the users are looking for. So if we're going to spend X amount of money, this is where we need to make those investments. So I had a large negotiation with the executive team to really help reframe their understanding of what the value was, who the user was, and what the overall value to the company was. Like, getting back to the idea of recreating the wheel, right? This is information which makes these processes easier, about, putting contextual information into business development proposals, pulling out the specific data for meetings and all of that, and working that through and making them and do that. And it was something that was a very interesting conversation, because the paths started to diverge between what the executive committee and sort of what the product was actually delivering versus what the executive committee was most interested in. Thankfully, again, it goes back to the fact that the executive team was enlightened, and were able to walk through that, and after a few meetings understood where I was coming from, and we were able to work out a very good agreement for budgeting and sort of where it would go. Now, still ended up spending a little bit of money developing the visual, but it was far less a priority than what they were looking to do initially.
Can we look at that from a sort of a user experience development standpoint? I know that's one of your strengths, and in our personal knowledge graph working group, that's one of our weaknesses, because we've got so many people who are able to do the plumbing, but in terms of actually addressing the end users' ability to work with what they've got, it's less effective.
Yeah, and I have fell into that fell into a few pitfalls along this path. You know, from my perspective, when you start to take the data from the different silos, it's really interesting from a product perspective and a development perspective to pull up the graph visual and to really start to be like, oh, you double click, you move things around, but you start to lose the actual user and what they're looking to do with it. At the same point, as you're developing the proof of concept or the initial things, everybody says they love these visuals, right? They want these visuals, right? And they want to be able to get in there and interact and do that exploratory research. And it's being able to decipher what's the exploratory research and what is the end goal they're trying to achieve. And I fell into that trap where I got, the user said, oh, we want these visuals or we want this. And so, sure, the proof of concept that I developed had these really cool visuals, and we built it in React, and it was really neat. You double clicked on things expanded, different colors, all of this really cool and interesting stuff. But spent probably too much time focused on that. And it's a challenge because when you present someone with a research sort of tool and they don't have specific questions that they need to answer right then and there, they start to go into the exploratory mode, and that stuff sort of they gravitate towards that, like, oh, this is interesting, we should change this colors, or that was interesting. So it's really about focusing the users as you're sort of developing with the proof of concept and the use cases. What specific questions are you trying to answer? Yeah. What specific data are you looking for? What specific challenges are you trying to overcome? And really working with them, and not anything. One, I think the pitfall I fell into was being like, hey, look, we developed this really cool, we had the business objective, we had all of this, and then we would just present it to folks and they'd be like, oh, do this, do that, do that. And I wasn't really focusing on that use case development at the user level. Once the product was sort of, you had it in beta and you can really start to use it, is can you answer these questions, and really getting that focus in those meetings. I think that is crucial, to be able to understand exactly what the users are, the challenges they're trying to overcome. And the visuals are cool, but you have to be able to find ways to decipher them, because everybody's going to say they're just cool and you think it's great, and they'll use it, and it turns out they won't. I should have learned my lesson before, because the initial product I developed a few years before that also ran into that same problem. Now, there were some technical challenges with how that visual was built, and I thought that was the reason for it. That people weren't using it. It was really slow, took a long time to load. The connections were really difficult to maneuver. So I thought that was the issue, but it turns out it's just really focusing on the user and really asking specific questions about their challenges and making sure that the data and the information presented back meets it.
So is that an issue of extraction, or was it was it a problem of how to design information to present that effectively?
By extraction, I'm not quite sure I understand.
In terms of actually getting the data that they wanted, I see this as like a two-level problem. The first is identifying the information I actually need from a design perspective, so that could be things like queries and so forth, to be able to answer the business question that's being raised. And then there's the other, whereas the actual getting access to the information that sits below that to be able to back that up. And I'm wondering whether you found it more one or the other, or was it a case of it was both?
I think it was a case of both. In particular, in with building out the knowledge graph in this particular instance, we started with one or two massive data sets that we felt would be the biggest relationships, the most value. And so we would then, show those to the users, and they would be like, oh, we want more information. It was about extraction, right? You need more data, you need more information. And then so their first aspects of when you talk to them is that it wouldn't meet their specific use case because we didn't have that data in it. So the first, oh, I want access to this. And then from there, they would then go to the visual automatically because it wasn't meeting the initial aspect of it. And then it what turned into, well, how are we formatting? How are we presenting the information that's there? And without having all of the information that they were looking for, they started to focus on other things. So I think it's a sort of a two-pronged problem there on that front. At the same point, in an agile environment, right? You in a lean environment too, you want to get people, talking, giving you the feedback that's necessary. And it's you have a long roadmap too, for especially from a data perspective for a knowledge graph, like, oh, we'll introduce this, we'll introduce that. And you simply can't spend a year, 18 months pulling in all those different data sources and going to the user at that point. So it's a really big challenge, because you're going to be presenting things that don't have the full data in them, and you're going to have to sort of also get the right feedback you're looking for at the right time.
It also sounds like the idea of the visuals is almost a natural progression. People really don't understand what you're talking about, and you give them minutia, they don't get it. But particularly if you're talking to executives who are funding things typically, or will support the funding things, people from the grassroots often can't fund things. So if you're going to the executives and trying to sell the idea, the visuals help sell the idea before you have the muscle in the system. And to some degree, it allows people to quote unquote get it. And so it seems to me that's almost a natural progression. They have the visuals front loaded, and then as you get buy-in and get access to data, load out the minutia and naturally move toward the worker bees, because you're going to have executive support, and the worker bees are going to listen a little bit better anyway, and then build it out. The other question I have is, how do you keep the data current? You've got a lot of turnover, a lot of, that's one of the, how do you prune this graph, and how do you have it continually updated? I assume you're reading other databases, so it automatically updates some, but if people have their own secret spreadsheets, how do you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so you're right, like the database that was built there, we had external sources. In this case, one of the external sources was the lobbying database produced by the federal government. A lot of people who we work with lobbied at the federal level or worked in the federal government. So we had these databases, which, we built the pipeline, we built the structure, integrated it, it would come in, every night we'd, put it in the database. And so those aspects were we're doing that. But then how do you then work with a partner team that likes to work in Excel versus a partner team that likes to work in a document, right? And so what I would do is I would, in this case, it wasn't a large enough organization to really build in the type of client extraction, information, and have them upload information. So what I would do is I would work with them at the client level, and sort of, get the information and just make sure that I was talking to them quite often and be like, hey, look, do you have new clients? If so, how are you tracking them? And trying to standardize them. And the other aspect I work on is I would have each group, if there was something that from a standardization standpoint, from a client perspective, like whether it was an Excel spreadsheet that worked really well, I would introduce it to the other group, and help them also standardize their processes. My end goal was to sort of build out a series of templates for them that we could potentially migrate into the knowledge graph. But for us, it became an ad hoc process of working with each of the groups, making sure we understood their processes, and making sure that the information that was put into the database. Now, in this instance, a lot of the information from the campaigns we got once it was done, which was great, but you're not going to, the value of that database probably is not going to be in real time. It potentially could be, but that real-time value just isn't going to be there with the different groups and how they work in being a smaller organization. But yeah, that was a really big challenge, was to get them to see the value in putting their information, or like, hey, look, a Word doc that I created over here for this, it's like, but yes, we want that. We'll pull it in, we'll extract the information and the content, we'll pull it in. Whereas to them, it really held, oh, it was a one-time thing, I'm done with it, I don't need this anymore. And so they just file it away. They understood the value of the spreadsheets and the tracking and all the stuff, that other stuff they were doing, and why that was important. But it was really getting them to understand that, we wanted all that information so that we could find the connections and infer the connections within it, and working with them to do that. And that was a huge challenge that I honestly don't think we ever we didn't come anywhere near close to solving. And it's something that is going to be a continually different challenge, especially once you start to work outside of structured systems.
In my past experience, I found the greatest aid to standardization was needing to communicate between different individuals. So you could have people working in this environment and somebody else could work in that environment. But if they needed to trade information on a consistent basis, they tended to go to a common interface. Is that something that would be useful in this environment? I mean, being able to move from Word to Excel or to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that environment, I mean, that was definitely, I left the organization before they continued the development down the path, but that was eventually the path that we were going for, was sort of the standardization of being able to communicate back and forth between teams, and sort of developing and sort of laying overall sort of a company process, like this is what we do for, if it's a media campaign, these are, the fields and things like that, in integrating them into a user interface that would then feed the information into the knowledge graph. That was the end goal. But a lot of that was going to take a lot of time, a lot of workflow work, which again just doesn't have the return that other types of investments have. And that was really, that was the direction we were going. But I moved on to other projects before that point.
Hey, Steve, just following up on that question. Sounds like you have a ton of, for lack of a better word, Word documents and unstructured stuff that you had to filter through. Was most of that manual, or were you able to use like natural language processing or some other things to help you build your knowledge graph?
Some was manual. So initially what we would do is we would take a look at a sample of work, right? If they had, oh, here are all of our client reports and there's 57 of them. Okay, well, let's take a look at a few of them. We'll see what we got. And then we would figure out ways to extract it. We do natural language processing. If it was PDFs, we do OCR and pull that information out. And, it wasn't something that needed to be 100% accurate. For our instances, they were looking for interesting pieces of information, and they'd been losing this information, in these folders for a long time. So they were happy with 95% retention or 95% understanding of this data and pulling it in. So we would do, we'd use NLP for Word docs and all of that. We would do some manual. Oh, we've got three spreadsheets over here of 100 rows. Okay, we'll just move it in. Or we've got 6 documents over here. We would just figure out the best way to move those in. But the larger data sets, yes, we would figure out ways to extract the content. We'd also, one of the cooler things that we were working towards is we did data lineage as well too. So if we pulled something out of a document, we would also, when it was presented, whether it be a search result or through the visual, you could go back and find the link and say, oh, this is where this document is, and go directly back to the document as well too. So that enabled a tremendous amount of research to happen a lot faster, but also let the user see the transparency of it so that they could go back and see, oh, this is where it showed up in the Excel document, or this is where it showed up in the user. And that level of transparency built a tremendous amount of trust in the product, which it was very, very helpful for that. And that lineage aspect is, I think, from a knowledge graph perspective, is crucial. When you're pulling out information from different sources, people really, especially when it's talking about a report that they've most likely read, or in this case, a report that they most likely read, or they knew that their partner, 3 doors down, they remember reading it, right? They like, this is good information from when they're presented in the knowledge graph, but they know there's more there. They'll want to go back. They'll want to see it. They'll want to make sure they have all the information, specifically about the original source.
Awesome. Thank you.
Ultimately, it seems like there could be this GitHub style knowledge graph that could be developed with the the analytics, the user level analytics sort of informing, here's what's valuable for me.
Yep.
All the personalization and, the ratings and the dates and everything that people look at when they're using GitHub. I mean, ultimately, is that a point where you'd like to get to with something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I saw it sort of with the different workflow, I'd love there be ability from a workflow perspective, like, hey, look, here's what I'm working on, right? Here's the project, very similar, like, here's the project, here are all my documents, right? Uploading those. And then, some sort of other aspect of it coming in, getting that information, pulling it into Knowledge Graph, making it then accessible to others who could go in and find it, sort of, if needed, just get the context on one end, or burrow back all the way into your own repository and get the information that's needed, whether it be the specific document, whether it be the citation, whether it be the, more information about what else may be in this specific folder or specific aspect of it. But yeah, I'd love to get to that point where it is sort of that GitHub and you're pushing information in, the the graph and the knowledge graph, or extracting the information, and then being able to make that information far more accessible to the front end users. Yeah, I mean, that would be, to me, tremendous, and being able to do that, sort of the personal repository type of idea.
And along those lines, it seems like Origin Trail is trying to do that for supply chains. And I'm just wondering what your take is on their approach, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I am familiar a little bit with Origin Trail, but I have not spent the time to really get into them, to their product. So I'm not I haven't fully researched that.
How about decentralized hash tables and those kinds of things? Ever worked with those, or content addressing?
No, nothing. I mean, I've heard of them and I know the concepts, but I haven't specifically in my experiences.
Okay.
Well, it looks like our hour is, essentially used up. Is there any final questions for Steve? No? Okay. Well, Steve, this has been extremely informative. I'm actually going to go back on the recording and listen to a few things again, as I typically do, but this one in particular. And I may have some follow-up questions on workflow for you. If anybody else is interested in reaching Steve, his email was in the last thread I sent out, so feel free to contact him. I'm volunteering you, Steve, but I assume that you're open to further dialogue.
Of course. Feel free to email me. And, I know I mentioned in the beginning too, that I had 2 experiences. This was just one. I do have another experience and also working as part of a group and dealing with a large, massive organization and building out a knowledge graph sort of in the learning space and dealing with the different groups and that is, massive organizational aspect as well too. So if you want to talk on that, just let me know as well. Yeah,
well, actually, would you like to go talk about that second one in a part 2? We meet every 2 weeks.
Sure, if you'd like to have me. We can do that at that point.
Okay, sounds good. I'll talk to you offline.
Great.
All right, everyone. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Really good. Thank you.
Yeah.